it's too good an opportunity to miss with having such experts in the field with me to look at some of the confusion over the common language, or perhaps it isn't a common language that we share when we're describing an ink. And Paul, Millie and I have found that when we've been talking to lithographers, they've used terms. We have thought we've understood what they meant by buttery or greasy or long or short, but it transpires that we aren't always talking about the same things. So, Ivan, can I ask you, starting with long and short, what does a long ink look like? Can I pass you the microphone? Describe those two terms.
I guess the way I see it is how ink can be long or short when using and when you're mixing the ink. When you have a very long ink, it's tend to be quite loose, and when you lift your palette knife, it drips down really long, rather when, for instance, when adding some type of magnesium or stiffer ink on its own, when you mix it, it holds up to the knife very shortly, thus short ink, and very long ink when it's more loose or more,
Interestingly, we would agree with that entirely, but we've discovered when talking to people that even with those two terms, some people mean something different. Some people will describe what happens when you drop an ink from a knife, so how far does it naturally fall. What you've described is, can you lift it up? So how long will the bead be? Now, it's not greatly different, although there are the internal forces within an ink of rheology which actually mean they probably are different in a way. But Steve, if you had to take a long ink and change it or modify it, can you do it? What would you do it with?
Usually magnesium carbonate would be what one would modify an ink for to make it a bit shorter, but it's not the best thing to do. I mean, ideally, I think we'd all agree that you would take an ink and use it as it exists and probably look for a different ink that was more suited rather than try and adjust it. But if you have to adjust it, I would probably use magnesium carbonate, and that would make it shorter. But you have to use it fairly quickly, I think, because if you mixed it and left it, it's going to alter the ink far more than just using it straight away.
And Stephanie, would you agree that it's best not to modify an ink, or do you insist on adding fag ash and engine oil to every ink that you use? Indeed, what were you taught about adding? Can I pass you the microphone?
Yeah. So yeah, modifying was always kind of only if you really need it. Ideally, you just want to be able to use the ink straight out the can. Otherwise, sometimes it's more like varnishes that we often put in. The only time I've ever really used it is if for some reason I've got really delicate and light tones on my stone or plate that for some reason when I'm coming to print it in a coloured ink they aren't picking up. So normally some varnish is added to allow that to happen. I mean, yeah, we used to put Maginot ink all the time when I was a student because we only had offset inks, so obviously they were very loose in terms of trying to roll up for hand lithography. But yeah, I mean, we were probably putting way too much in than we were supposed to.
Tell us what's actually happening when you add a talc to an ink.
Yeah, well, there's a few things going on. We're going to body up the ink. So as well as shortening the ink, it's going to body up as well. You might have to compensate with some varnish if you're doing that. Talc is very soft, and magnesium carbonate is very soft. And these they tend to be quite nodular and round, so they'll flow and roll over each other quite well. But by breaking up the structure of the ink and structure of the oil a little bit more, it just allows that to snap off and break easier, which can help shorten the ink somewhat. So a little less oil, a bit more transparent pigment in terms of magnesium carbonate. That's just going to help those oils separate out.
With lithography, of course, if you're adding solid content after we've made it into what we hoped was a perfect ink that you'd never need to modify, you're adding a large colourless particle. It is relatively speaking, the size of a beach ball to a marble in terms of pigment. What's the risk in terms of when it's on the stone, things that can happen in terms of emulsification? In fact, Steve, I believe you were saying that earlier, if you add, can I pass it back to you?
By adding magnesium carbonate, in my view, it's much more likely for things to go wrong or for the stone to scum up, just because you've got the chance of the water and the oil mixing more because of the larger particle, is my assumption. But and in my experience, it is much more likely to scum if you change the nature of the ink rather than just using it.
And possibly part of that is magnesium carbonate actually being relatively having a certain porosity to it with water, so it'll attract more water to it. So it's going to drag a bit more water into the ink, which is probably why you see the scumming as well.
Paul's going to find from behind him on the bench there a slab of butter, because when talking to printmakers, lithographers, many of you have used the term that they like or dislike a buttery ink. What do they mean by that? Do they mean that it increases your cholesterol risk, or do you want to have an answer of that? Is it a term that should be used or can be used with ink, or do you think it's really a painting term which has slipped across into print? Let me pass you the microphone.
To me, buttery ink or the consistency of buttery ink, it really is for me something that determines how it comes off the stone or the plate to get set onto the paper. And so I do believe there's a time and thing. I think it's it's something like sets well or something like what is it, the tack modifier. Tack modifier that helps you get different details appear. It can also be sometimes with same with the magnesium. To me, is also like even though if the environment that you're printing is very controlled, it's not so much an issue. But if you have a lot of weather differences, whether high moisture or very dry within the same year, then you have to adjust your ink for that as well. And so that's something that I think is when we used to add more magnesium or other modifiers to it to really accommodate that. But as we said earlier also, it was more for the inks that we use for like color or printing or additioning ink, rather than stones or plates that are just printed with the preparation ink or the roll-up black, which you can perfectly print, but you don't have to adapt them. And if you adapt them, you use the varnishes or the things rather than magnesium, I would say.
Okay, thank you. I want to turn now to Millie with a question for you. And your question is, what is the capital of Paraguay? No, that's not your question. Your question is, in those early weeks and months, we'll find out and get back to you on the answer. I think it wouldn't be Asuncion, something like that. No, I'm probably wrong. We struggled with what people meant by grease or a greasying, and we went down a few rabbit holes with that. What did we try? What did we think it meant? Where did we land?
Yeah, so the thing with that is this sort of descriptive word of grease was being used to describe the ink itself.
Greasy.
Greasy. And so Paul and I, in our initial thoughts were that the ink must have had a grease element to it, so in the form of grease.
And I can add to that grease is indeed a possible additive to ink, so it certainly wasn't beyond the realms of possibility. And indeed, some of the older formulations we look at might even describe grease as being part of that. So it was a realistic thing for us to consider.
Yeah.
And this maybe ties into that terminology between actual grease and the way people use the term greasy when referring to litho inks.
And so we like Paul just said, some inks do have grease in them and some don't. So this led us to
look at recipes that contain grease and that also didn't, and looking at what that grease was in historical recipes, and whether we needed to make amendments or look for alternative greases now. I'm thinking specifically of things like lanolin, which we didn't want to use this time, so we've used an alternative. The word greasy is one good example that came up for us.
And the reason we didn't use lanolin, which is the natural grease that comes from sheep's wool, that was to future-proof the product to make it suitable for vegans, am I right? Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Let's pass back.
I'm quite interested in the term greasy and buttery. To me, and Ivan and Steph might disagree. To me,
Disagree with each other?
Well, we might disagree. To me, a greasy ink is one where you get a stain on the paper that's where the oil is actually seeped out, rather than a behavioural quality. Whereas buttery is something that happens when you mix with the knife, and it actually has less tack or whatever, and the knife throws through it. Its actual properties when you use it is something different. But to me, buttery is when you're mixing an ink and the knife actually flows through it easily. So there are hard terms. I don't know whether you'd agree with those.
I think so. I was just also thinking about what would I see as a greasy ink, or like indeed, like Setswell is for me more buttery than greasy, although it could arguably be seen as a grease. But I guess greasy is I guess it's more like staining afterwards, and that like when you put some paper on top that it would offset on it, and that it had like a greasy after after result, and it's indeed like
let's pass it back to Steph.
Yeah, I would probably say this. I wonder if there were some of these things, because when you're starting off as a student being taught lithography, often we're stripped right down to basics. So the basic principle of lithography working is because grease and water repel each other. Therefore, you're drawing with grease, and therefore your ink has to be greasy. So then almost in some ways, grease then just becomes this kind of generic term that we use to say that our ink is greasy because, the way we are taught is that it works because this is greasy. It doesn't necessarily have to mean that there is grease in it and all these other things, but it's just because the fundamentals of lithography, when you try and explain it to anyone, someone who isn't even a printmaker, you basically say it works because grease and water repel each other, and that's the basic principles of it. So then it, no doubt, probably, the reason why we say greasy is more to do with that than almost anything to do with the actual making of the ink.
And of course, having actual grease in the ink will naturally then help with that water repellency as well. So that there's you can see the confusion that Millie and I faced, and why we spent actually a lot of time discussing it, putting in various formulas. You can imagine it's not just the case of there's some in there or there's not. There's a question of how much. And how much against all the other ingredients. So ladder testing various quantities to see these different types of grease and waxes and fats to see actually what is their effect and how do they influence the outcome and the performance and the functionality of the ink. So it does open up to quite a challenging area for us, and a lot of time spent, I think. Not wasted, Amelia. I wouldn't say wasted. Yeah.
I think that it is interesting that we've come on such a long way. We find there is commonality, but we still don't entirely, not we don't see eye to eye, but we are interpreting terms differently. You mentioned Setwell, we call our product Print Fix.
Yeah.
And people would add Print Fix to add an attribute to help transfer. We wouldn't really think it says much on the greasiness of an ink because people don't add that much to it. So that would be an attribute. Interestingly, when you as printmakers use the term buttery, you are talking about as the ink sits there in front of you, what it looks like, how it's going to behave if you roll it out. For us as ink makers, we don't see it in the moment. We see it over a period of time, and its thixotropic nature. So when we hear somebody saying buttery, Paul will explain what thixotropy is, but we're seeing that as a physical description of its rheology. Do you want to describe thixotropy?
Thanks for that challenge, Michael. Yeah, yeah, it's like explaining the offside rule in football, isn't it? But yeah, I mean, essentially, it's the behaviour, the rheology and behaviour of a fluid when exposed to energy. It could be heat or it could just be movement. The ability to apply energy to a product and to thin, and it makes the product thinner and looser in that respect. And quite often, pretty much any material that consists of a liquid with solid particles in it will exhibit a thixotropic behaviour. So inks are exactly that, and paints are exactly that. And the more energy you put in, the thinner they become, and that would obviously change the way the product transfers. So I think you guys may be able to add something to that in terms of knowing how much you have to work a product before you can then start a printing process. So there's a lot of time and energy, or maybe even hot plates used to adjust the viscosity, and that's relying on this thixotropic behaviour. Yeah, we're going to add something in it.
I think it's quite interesting, and something we've had to be careful about over time is when everybody talks about their old tin of ink that's thick and solid and whatever, its thixotropic properties have mean over time as it's got stiffer and stiffer and stiffer. So when somebody says, can't you make me a tin the same as the one, that's not going to happen, is it, in the same way, because it has steadily, the particles have absorbed the oil, and it's got stiffer and thicker. And it's something.
Yeah, and it's worth adding to that with a thixotropic behaviour, when we add the energy, it becomes thinner. But of course, when we stop putting energy into it, it returns back to its original state. So it loses that energy, and the body builds back into the ink. And certainly a tin then that's left for a very long time will be exceptionally stiff for a number of reasons, but thixotropy being part of it as well.
I remember also, like in that sort of sense, it just got to me in the Federfarbe that we used to use to print. It was already 10 years old before it was sold.
Yeah.
So in that sort of sense, it already had kind of that property, and when that stock all got finished, then that property was gone, and so the new ink would never be 10 years old. So in that sort of sense, it also changed a lot, and that's why you kind of hold on to that ink, and they don't have that backlog, because everything is absorbed by the litho community before you can actually stock it.
Michael, is it worth talking about a few additional points that build that stiffness over time?
Yeah. I'll pass back to you.
Yeah. So we had thixotropy, but that tends to be a little bit more immediate. I add it now, I stop adding the energy now, and it relatively quickly. And it depends on the material exactly how quick that happens. But linseed oil is polymerizing, so what happens is the chains of linseed are actually getting longer and longer over time. Or it also goes through a process of oxidation, so that's slightly different. That's not the chains getting longer, that's chains being joined together with oxygen. So linseed oil really wants to do this, and that's the drying process that it goes through, and it starts right at the beginning, from the moment the oil is liberated from the seed, right away to hundreds of years after being applied to a painting or a print, that there's still an amount of oxidation and stiffening taking place. So in storage, this is happening. We try to put seals over the top, and we try to cover, tape up the cans to slow down that process. Or indeed, if you're looking to stiffen it up, maybe we're going to expose it to a little bit more air or high temperatures. So that's really going to start stiffening the ink up over time. So when you get 20 or 30 years of storage, the polymerization and probably the oxidation together have both contributed now a lot more stiffness to that ink. And you're quite right, you will not get that from a brand new fresh you can imagine that the challenge for us as manufacturers is that we have to make something exactly the same or as close to as possible, and we can't leave it 10 years to find out whether that's going to do it. So we actually have to replicate and get the mirror image done as it's produced. And so at the point of production, that's all our quality control is, that when it was produced, this is where it was, because it has to go out to you guys. There's no point in it sitting on shelves for 10 years. And certainly we've already discovered then, and this is part of our project of developing these inks, is that actually the stiffness that you want, how is that going to look in the can after 6 months, after 12 months? What are we going to have? And in some way, the project is limited by that time scale before we fully know how stiff it's going to be. And we've seen the sample we've brought in. I don't know if we can get that to camera again, Michael, or is it 230? But that's an example. When we took this off the mill, it was not this stiff. And so it's a really interesting one. And actually, even a week later, it wasn't this stiff. So this is something that's developed over sort of a few months, and that's what we're going to have to really work on now. Is to if it's too stiff, you guys aren't going to use it. Although sometimes there's no such thing, I guess, as too stiff for a printmaker. But yeah. Go on.
Maybe it's more of a question for me then. Is that the additives that are put in to make it stiff, is that different than if it would naturally stiffen over time, and would that change?
Yeah, so that's a really interesting question, and it's quite multifaceted actually. So first of all, this polymerization we talk about, this lengthening of linseed oil, we can, we don't do it, we buy it from the linseed supplier, and they can treat that linseed oil to make that longer. So this is getting the viscosity up, creating a lot more body. So we start off with thicker materials with a really thick linseed oil, and they call that stand oil. So they expose it to the high temperature, no oxygen. Without the oxygen, it can't cross-link and oxidize. So it's got all this energy and it wants to do something, so it starts grabbing onto its friends, the other linseed oil particles, and it gets longer and longer and longer. And you can imagine those longer chains all get entangled up together, and that tanglement of those chains creates body and resistance to flow. Okay, so that's where we now will have this really thick, heavy body. So we start off with something that's particularly heavy. So that's the first step. The second step was we're now going to put materials in, and you can imagine if I just keep putting a powder into any liquid, eventually it's going to suck up more and more of that liquid, and at some point you're going to hit a critical point at which it almost stops being liquid, and now it's going to be quite like a putty, and I can keep going and working that in, and it's almost going to become quite solid. So the second part of getting that body for you guys and adjusting that after the oil is the pigment loading. So how much solid particle we put in there to give more body. We haven't done it with these. I think we can be honest. You can get bodying agents which will try and promote and put some long chains of other materials in there that help create body. We haven't needed to do that. So what we've been able to produce is something that relies on the oil and it relies on the pigment loading to really achieve the body that you. And the third part then is when we do manufacture it is softer, but we see that body development take place then in subsequent weeks and months. So we already have an idea in supplying these new materials that actually we're probably not going to take it off the mill, stick it in a can and send it to you. We're probably going to take it off the mill, put it in a can, give it some weeks and months before we then that matures, and then that's something we can send out. Yeah.
That's a good term, Ivan, maturing, because the inks that you guys use, oil-based products, they're natural products, and they do age, and they do change. If you think of acrylic paints or inks, all that really happens is they can dry, but everything about them is artificial, so the thickness of an acrylic ink will be adjusted by the drop of a thickening agent. That's all it is. So it's an entirely chemical construct. An oil-based product, it will change because it is natural. I'm conscious we've had a really good chat. I'm also conscious we've used the term thixotropy. Now, you know, if somebody's accidentally done placement of a product on national television, they always, in the interests of fairness, say other fizzy drinks are available. Well, I think there are other phenomena in rheology. So thixotropy is just one. It's the most common in non-Newtonian liquids that as Paul described, you add energy, the viscosity goes down. There is one which is the direct opposite, which is called dilatancy, and we see it in putty. Best of all, we see it in corn flour. If you've never seen, if you ever played with corn flour and turned it into, you add water, and when you put energy in and you try and handle it, you can turn it from a liquid into a tennis ball in your hand. It's great fun. So that's dilatancy. It doesn't trouble us at all. We're entirely in the realm of thixotropy. But thanks ever so much for the conversation. I think we've learned a lot. Thank you.